Imagine waking up in the morning and discovering that something terrible happened inside your own home while you were sleeping only a few steps away. A quiet cabin in the mountains of California became the scene of one of America's most disturbing unsolved crimes. No clear suspect, no final answers, and a mystery that has haunted investigators for more than 4 decades. This is the story of Cabin 28. In the early 1980s, Keddie was a small and peaceful community located in Northern California. Among the many cabins in the area was Cabin 28, a place where families lived a normal life away from the noise of big cities. Inside this cabin lived Sue Sharp and her children. To neighbors, they were just another family trying to build a quiet life. But on one night in April 1981, everything changed. On the morning of April 12, 1981, the quiet mountain community of Keddie woke up to a nightmare. As the first light of the morning reached Cabin 28, a horrifying discovery was waiting inside. 3 people were found dead. Inside the cabin, the victims were Sue Sharp, her 15-year-old son, John Sharp, and John's 17-year-old friend, Dana Wingate. For the people of Keddie, it was almost impossible to believe. Just hours earlier, Cabin 28 had looked like any other family home. Now, it had become the scene of one of California's most disturbing unsolved crimes. As investigators slowly searched the cabin, they discovered clear signs that a violent struggle had taken place. Every room seemed to tell part of the story, but none of it explained who was responsible or why it happened. And then, one chilling question began to haunt everyone involved in the investigation. How could something so horrifying happen inside a family home, while children were sleeping only a few steps away? The investigation began almost immediately. Detectives arrived at Cabin 28, determined to find out exactly what had happened inside the home that night. They carefully searched the cabin for evidence. They interviewed people connected to the victims, and they worked tirelessly, hoping to uncover the truth. But as the investigation continued, the case became far more complicated than anyone had expected. Over the years, some important clues were lost. Other pieces of evidence raised even more questions than answers. Investigators struggled to connect the evidence to one specific person. As time passed, new theories began to emerge. Some investigators believed the person responsible may have been someone the victims already knew. Others believed more than one person could have been involved. But despite decades of investigations, countless interviews, and years of unanswered questions, no one has ever been officially convicted for the murders connected to the Cabin 28 case. But as investigators looked deeper into the case, their attention began to turn toward people who were already connected to the small community of Keddie. One name appeared again and again: Martin Smart. Smart lived in a nearby cabin, and he was known to the Sharp family. Another man connected to Smart was Severin John Bobade, better known as Bo. Both men were questioned by investigators, but neither was ever charged with the murders. Years later, new information brought their names back into the investigation. A letter written by Martin Smart, and allegations of statements he had made after the murders, raised serious questions about what investigators may have missed in 1981. Then, in 2016, a rusty hammer was discovered in a pond near Cabin 28. It reportedly matched the description of a hammer Smart had said was missing around the time of the murders. But investigators never publicly established that the hammer was the murder weapon. And the questions didn't stop there. In 2018, Investigators revealed that DNA recovered from a piece of tape at the crime scene had matched a known living suspect. But the identity of that person was never publicly revealed. More than 4 decades later, the names, the evidence, and the unanswered questions still surround Cabin 28. And somewhere inside all of those unanswered questions may be the truth about what happened that night. But there was one more mystery inside Cabin 28. One that investigators could not explain. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing. She had been seen at the neighboring Seabolt cabin earlier that evening, and she had returned home to Cabin 28 later that night. But when Sheila discovered the scene the next morning, Tina was nowhere to be found. Her 3 younger brothers, Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin, were still alive inside the cabin. But Tina had disappeared. For investigators, this raised a terrifying possibility. Had Tina been taken from the cabin that night? Or had something else happened before the murders were discovered? For years, her disappearance remained one of the biggest unanswered questions in the case. Searches were conducted, but Tina could not be found. Then, 3 years later, a discovery in Northern California changed the case forever. In 1984, a man searching for bottles near Camp 18 discovered human remains. Investigators were eventually able to identify those remains as Tina Sharp. She was only 12 years old. The discovery finally answered one question: what had happened to Tina? But it created another. Who had taken her from Keddie? And why? Even after Tina's remains were identified, investigators still could not determine exactly what had happened to her during those missing years. Her disappearance had become another piece of the Cabin 28 puzzle. A puzzle that still had no complete solution. And once again, Cabin 28 left investigators with more questions than answers. But even after Tina Sharp was identified, the Cabin 28 investigation was still far from over. For years, the case remained largely forgotten. Then, decades after the murders, new attention was brought back to Cabin 28. Investigators began taking another look at the evidence, the old reports, and the unanswered questions that had remained for so long. In 2016, a possible piece of evidence was discovered in a pond near Keddie. It was an old hammer, and investigators examined whether it could be connected to the murders. But the discovery did not provide the breakthrough everyone had hoped for. The hammer was never publicly established as the murder weapon. Then came another development. In 2018, investigators announced that DNA evidence from the crime scene had produced a match to a living person. But the identity of that person was not publicly released. And without a clear identification, or enough evidence to establish exactly what happened, the case remained unresolved. More than 4 decades had passed since that terrible night. People had come and gone. Evidence had aged. And memories had become harder to verify. Yet the questions surrounding Cabin 28 remained. Who planned the attack? Who entered the cabin that night? And how did everyone responsible disappear without leaving behind enough evidence to finally identify them? For a case that began in a quiet California mountain community, the mystery had survived for generations. But even after all these years, the story of Cabin 28 was far from over. The investigation had produced suspects, theories, and pieces of evidence that seemed to point in different directions. But none of them could provide the one thing investigators needed most: a clear answer. As the years passed, the case slowly faded from national attention. The newspapers stopped reporting about it. Investigators moved on to other cases. And the people who remembered that night grew older. But Cabin 28 never completely disappeared from the memories of those who lived in Keddie. The unanswered questions remained. Who entered the cabin that night? Why did the violence happen inside a place that was supposed to be a home? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how did the killer manage to leave without being caught? Over the decades, new information occasionally brought the case back into the spotlight. But every possible breakthrough seemed to create another mystery. For investigators, the case became a puzzle with missing pieces. For the families, it became a wound that never completely healed. And for Cabin 28 itself, it became a place forever connected to one terrible night in April 1981. More than 40 years have passed. But the questions remain. The evidence has grown old. The memories have faded. And many of the people connected to the case are no longer here to tell their stories. Yet one question still refuses to disappear. What really happened inside Cabin 28? Perhaps someday, the missing pieces will finally come together. Until then, the mystery of Cabin 28 remains unsolved.